When we now come to the end of this module, we can say, well, what are the practical considerations then in terms of space? What are some of the practical things that we need to keep in mind as we try and develop and design worship? That we need to remember that actually designing worship is not just about where you're going to put the prayers and which songs you're going to sing and what sermon you're going to preach. But that in fact the space in which we're doing the worship itself has an impact on what happens during that worship. That if there's a disconnect between what you're trying to achieve in worship and the space in which you're trying to do it, then you're going to miss the point of what you're trying to do. And so we need to then take into consideration some of those practical considerations about doing it. So what are some of the considerations you have? Well, number one is to find, how do we help people to focus on God? How do we help people focus on God? And that means that whatever we do within the space needs to have that sense of the sacredness of God. Even if your particular area is one that's a basketball court during the week, but now becomes a church, it's about saying, how do we make this place into sacred space? Not just any space, not just the space that can be used for anything and that is cluttered and loses focus. But rather saying that when I come into this particular space, this one where I've come to meet and focus on God, how does it help me, or how does it distract me from doing that? Is there at least some icon, some form of connection, something that tells me that this is not just a lecture, this is not just an auditorium or a school classroom, but what is it that we can do to help people to focus on God? What is it that can connect that? The second thing that we need to look at is then, how do we help to develop participation? Remember that we've been saying all the way through so far that worship is about the corporate togetherness of bringing people together from all our different backgrounds, our different professions, our different even places of life, our different positions in life, to bring them all together to focus on God. How do we then foster participation? What can we do to help them participate in a meaningful way? You know, the problem with too often with participation, we think any participation is good. And so what we'll do is we will help the children to participate by putting them on show and letting them sing a particular song, and let all the mothers and fathers in the congregation go, oh, isn't that lovely? Is that participation? I think it's more exploitation. Instead of saying that somehow the children have to be put up front, or that we've got to read prayers in some meaningless connection or some meaningless repetition. Instead of doing the meaningless, let's think about how we can make that participation meaningful within that environment. And does that mean that maybe we have to change the chairs or change the pews or change the way in which the seating is? Maybe to make sure that if the sun's shining in someone's face, that we actually work out a way in which we deal with that. Those are the things that we need to look at and saying, how do we foster that level of participation within the life of the congregation? The third thing that we need to look at is the stranger. Too often our worship spaces are set up for those who know where they're going, to know what they're doing. Too often our worship is all about us as regulars. And often the regulars don't have any sense of what it would be like to come into the church for the first time, not knowing where to sit, not knowing if a seat is available. And therefore, to make that space welcoming, to make that space open so that it's clear to see where people can sit and where would be the best places to have that connection, especially for the stranger. Remember we spoke earlier about the space of fellowship, that place where you can welcome people. Well, that welcome needs to draw them into the sacred space, into the place where worship will take place as well. How do we make our environment more friendly? How do we make it more welcoming? If in fact there's a seat where people can't see from and we see strangers sitting there, maybe it's an opportunity to say to them, why don't you come and sit in this area? At least then you can see what's going on a little bit better. Those little things that we can do to enhance the participation, but more than that, to welcome the stranger, to make the stranger feel part of what's going to happen in the process of worship itself. Number 4 is we need to realize that we also need to engage the senses. One of the things that those temple churches did so well was the pageantry and the drama of worship. That there were incense, and there were bells and smells, and there were candles being lit, and all different things happening. There was something that was more than just oral. It wasn't just listening to some sermon, but there was also the sense of smell and the sense of sight, and sometimes even touch as we went through the process of communion. All those things can be enhanced in the way in which we look at the space that we're involved in. How does the space help us to use our senses? Can we not only hear, but can we see properly? Can we also hear and connect and feel and smell? All those different areas of senses can be used to enhance and to develop the process of worship, to enhance the connection and the way in which we come together to worship as a people of God. So engaging the senses. And what are the practical considerations then for that? Maybe it's the use of candles, maybe an occasional use of incense, or the occasional use of other concepts that are within there. Maybe the use of audiovisual, where we're using pictures and other video things, maybe as people coming into the worship, so that they begin to develop a process, a sense of connection into the life and the purpose of that sacred space. Finally, it's about developing community. And I know that it's tricky in our churches, is that our churches are set up really to look at the other person, the back of someone's head. But how do we actually overcome that? Possibly by the way in which we change the layout of a church. Maybe we can also talk about creating community in other ways, of the things that we can use in the pews, the ways in which those pews can be organized. The way in which we encourage people to greet each other before a service or during a service, that those things are ways in which we can seek to develop community. I want to say that we need to be practical in the way in which we see space. Space is so essential in understanding what we're going to be doing as worship, in worship, and how we're going to make worship from being something where just a collection of individuals come together to sing some songs and listen to a sermon, to becoming a place where truly we meet God, both in His Word, in His sacrament, and in His people.